This is Let's Talk Iowa, a podcast about the gap between Iowa's policies and the families living through them. Thank you for tuning in. Here in Iowa, families like mine are fighting through a broken mental health system. Let's talk about it. Welcome back to Let's Talk Iowa. In our last episode, we went deep into the personal side of a broken promise, the gap between the landmark class action versus Garcia settlement, and on-the-ground reality for families seeking mental health care. We talked about the fight, the frustration, and the feeling of navigating a system that often feels like it's designed to wear you down. Today, we're taking that conversation from the kitchen table to the state capitol, because a promise is only as good as the political will and the budget to back it up. A settlement on paper means very little without the funding and oversight to turn it into actual services for children. And after my personal experience with the Iowa Department of Health and Human Services, I've had a lot of time to think, and I'm starting to come to a pretty startling conclusion. It appears that DHHS has quietly opened a brand new division. And I alluded to it last time, but they're actually calling it the Bigfoot Division.
Oh my goodness, is that a real Sasquatch?
It seems that their top priority isn't so much providing actual mental health care as it is managing the perception of providing mental health care. Their strategy is just like a Bigfoot researcher. They produce a lot of blurry photos, some questionable footprints, and anecdotal evidence of a service that is perpetually just out of reach. They send you lists of providers that are as elusive as a clear Bigfoot photo. They could create complex case overseers who seem less like actual helpers and more like a team of cryptozoologists dedicated to tracking a service that, despite all the paperwork, is never quite confirmed to exist. And all the while, the kid who actually needs that care, they're left in the wilderness, right? Waiting for someone or something to show up and help them. It makes you wonder if DHHS spent less time on their elaborate Bigfoot expeditions and more time building an actual verifiable network of care. Maybe our kids wouldn't be lost in the woods in the first place.
Duh.
Anyway, to get an insider's perspective on all of this, I'm joined by State Senator Mike Zimmer. As a legislator in Des Moines, he is on the front lines of the very budget debates that determine whether essential services are funded or forgotten. In our conversation, we're going to pull back the curtain on the state's finances, discuss why Iowa has one of the lowest Medicaid reimbursement rates in the country, and explore the devastating link between our state's mental health shortcomings and its crisis in juvenile justice. This will be a critical look at the dollars and decisions that shape the lives of Iowa families. Let's get into it. Senator Zimmer, thank you so much for joining us on Let's Talk Iowa today. I really appreciate your time.
I appreciate the invitation.
Would you mind just telling us a little bit about yourself and your journey to the state senate?
Well, sir, I've reflected with my family that I have not even been retired 2 years. I retired from 40 years in public education on June 30th, 2023. And in what is supposed to be my retirement, I have since been elected to the Central DeWitt School Board and was elected president on my very first meeting when I was sworn in. And then 14 months after that, Governor Reynolds appointed Lieutenant Governor Chris Conoyer to that position, and she was our state senator. And so that left a seat open. And so we had a special election in basically December 19th or thereabouts, right before Christmas. And the governor then announced the election on January 28th, I believe, somewhere around that time frame. And so we basically, this was not something I was looking at doing, anticipating at doing, but I had a number of people approach me about, hey, would you be interested in running? And I was like, well, life's an adventure. And I had not been happy with a number of pieces of legislation that had been signed into law over the last almost 10 years, especially those that have been impacting public education. I just said, we can do better. And I felt that I had a skill set that maybe would be valuable to the citizens of Iowa, especially those that I've been serving in Jackson, Clinton, and Scott counties for 40 years. And so that's what happened. And next thing I know,
congratulations on your retirement from the public education system. 40 years is fairly impressive. I'm on, I think, 20. And yeah, I don't know if I could double that.
Well, time goes by fast.
And I interrupted you. I'm sorry. I was just very impressed with that. But please continue.
No, I just said on, I think it was a Tuesday, February 10th, I'm being sworn in at the Capitol of which I had never been to Iowa's Capitol. So that was basically the first time I'd been there was being sworn in on the Senate floor.
Ooh, that'd be quite the tour.
Yes, it was.
So you spent a lot of time in public education. And from what I heard, it was both in leadership and in classroom itself. Over your career, did you see a lot of changes in how schools respond to students with mental health needs?
Yes. And my learning path along the way has been pretty steep also, because I started my teaching career in 1983 in a small district in Miles, Iowa with the East Central Community School District, graduating class sizes of 52 to 48. And I ended my career at the Pleasant Valley Community School District, where our class sizes were basically 450 in a class. And so through that time, I had an opportunity to meet with so many parents and students that were experiencing just an array of difficulties. Some of them might be just a single incident that might happen at home or something in that, and others were very traumatic. A loss of a parent, abuse, alcoholism, drug abuse. I mean, the litany just goes on. And so over the course of that 40 years, and the fact that I went from a pretty small district where, your opportunity to encounter that is going to be less than when you get to a larger district where just by sheer size, you're going to experience different experiences of parents and students. So, yeah. And then the way Iowa has approached student mental health has changed dramatically. And even in the short period of time when I started in administration in 2002, when that was my responsibility of connecting parents, we would have a waiting list, especially if we had a student and parents that needed to get into a formal placement agency like Vera French or something like that. The waiting time could be anywhere from 6 weeks to 6 months for them to get in to see some help.
Right. Yeah. And that's been a common topic. And that's something my family has experienced as well, which was kind of the kick in the rear end I needed to kind of start speaking publicly and to start this podcast. And so I appreciate your comment on that. Thinking about that, are there any legislative solutions that you're exploring or have explored, or that you are just contemplating in a world where anything you could do would happen, that you think would help kind of integrate mental health services into a school setting in a sustainable way?
First, I would say there's a couple ways you can approach that. I think COVID certainly opened up the avenue of virtual or tele mental health. And I don't have a problem with that, but I'm a firm believer in face-to-face, that there is, the old adage that 85% of your communication is nonverbal and 15% is what's coming out of your mouth, that it's important, if at all possible, to have face-to-face human interaction if we can do that. So a route that in the district I was at previously, we were able to incorporate mental health therapists into the buildings. So we actually had an office space for them, and they would have a clientele of maybe 35 students or clients that they would be serving. And the way that worked is the school district was able to use some of their drug, tobacco, and alcohol, their DCAT funds, to establish a base wage for the mental health provider, and it might be $12 or $13 or $14 or $15,000, and then the mental health therapist would bill insurance for the services provided. And that is working. But what we're discovering in the growth of this is that if I'm a mental health therapist and I'm working for, say, Bethany or Vera French, something like an organization like that, they are able to take Medicaid clients, and their total organization can even out the cost of that service, because Medicaid would be paying less than what it would cost to actually provide that service. But then their regular insurance side, they would be able to do to balance out the rest of it, so to speak, their portfolio. But if I were a single sole proprietor mental health therapist, well, I couldn't afford to take a family that was on Medicaid because I didn't have that portfolio large enough to be able to balance it out. So then what we were experiencing was an inequity depending upon which therapist was assigned to which building. That also determined which level of students, depending upon their insurance, that they were able to see. So we're making strides, but I'm just giving you a little background that every time you would come up with one solution, then you would start hitting another thing that you hadn't anticipated, you weren't aware of. But that doesn't mean you stop doing it. You just keep working on trying to balance that out. And equity is a huge.
It's the law of unintended consequences, right?
Yes.
And that first, I really like what you said. I was talking with my doctor the other day about something similar. He, in his practice, has employed several therapists, and he said the same thing, that the Medicaid payout isn't enough to cover the costs of that service. And so he subsidizes it with the rest of his, the medical, physical medical side of his practice. And so he says, I'm really trying to bring mental health into what we're doing. It's just unfortunate that it has to be subsidized from a different aspect of his practice in order to make it possible. But it sounds very similar to what your school district was doing in a sense.
Oh, it's exactly what you just summarized. It's exactly, you're just confirming what we were experiencing, and we haven't come up with a solution yet, other than the school district increasing their portion of the base pay, so to speak, to try and make up for that. But again, then you look at, well, where's the school district getting their money from? Well, the school district's getting their money from two sources: property tax, or they're getting it from the state formula, state aid. So then, as a legislator, I get hit almost weekly about complaints about my property taxes are too high. I'm like, I get that. I hear what you're saying, and we can try to address that based upon income, because you have no control over the valuation of your property, but also trying to explain to people what services those property taxes are paying for. So it's just a cascading effect.
Right. It's a tangled mess in a lot of ways. I've had a lot of talks about property taxes as well. And one of the biggest, I think, complaints that kind of ties into that is, the elderly population, as they get older, being on a fixed income, wanting consistency, not necessarily wanting, no property tax, which, hey, let's be honest, who wouldn't take that, right? But wanting just consistent, and I'm trying to remember I think it was California where they charged, and I don't know if they still do, but this is years ago, they charged just a flat percentage based on the sale price. And then that was like locked in. And I understand that can be restricting in some ways, but I think a lot of the people's appeal was, I know what it's going to be from year to year, and there's not going to be a lot of change. But yeah, there's no real easy solution to that when you have a changing societal needs at play as well.
Well, I would agree. And this conversation is so timely regarding Medicaid, because I think this is an opportunity, whether the current administration intended to do so or not, but now people are starting to have an awakening about, what is this Medicaid and who's receiving this and how is this working? Because I just had an instant message from a constituent saying, we got to have Medicaid reform because my father went into a nursing home and we had to sell the house, and we had to liquidate all of our assets, and I'm down to nothing. And, he said, you came into this world with nothing, and you certainly left with absolutely nothing. So, yes, Medicaid helps with nursing home support. Medicaid helps with mental health. Medicaid, if it wasn't for Medicaid, my grandson just had brain surgery, mitigate seizures that were occurring. And I don't think we could have combined all of our funds as a family together to be able to afford that if it hadn't been for Medicaid.
Right. Yeah, it's been a blessing. I know in my household, my wife and I, we adopted 2 foster children out of the foster system, and just with their mental health needs and various things, it's been a godsend in that sense, because, as young parents, we weren't necessarily aware of what we were getting into financially, right? And so having that protection, knowing that services that they needed would be covered was a huge blessing. So I think there's a lot of good things about the Medicaid system, but I like how you touched on the, there are some struggles that come along with it as well, right? Like with going into a nursing home, we've experienced that with my grandparents, where, you want to build generational wealth as far as, you want to pass more on to your kids than you came with, but sometimes these services come at a cost, right? And so how does the state recoup what they need to continue offering services while still allowing citizens to build that generational wealth, in the hopes that, maybe down the line they won't need so much assistance from the state as well. So it's a very, very hard thing to navigate.
Absolutely.
So we kind of touched on how when you found out the waiting times that families faced, and it was kind of eye-opening. What was your initial reaction when you learned about this whole class action versus Garcia settlement, or how it was treating kids with mental health needs? What was your kind of just gut reaction to that?
Well, per our previous earlier conversation and preparing for this discussion, I was not aware of that at all, of that
Hmm.
CA versus Garcia. And I read the bill. The first thing I did was I pulled it up and I read the entire bill. The next thing I do, and I'm just relaying to your audience that this is how
Oh,
I
absolutely.
operate. Number one, research. Number two, read. Number three, I got on the phone and I started calling people that I have worked with, directors of special education, saying, hey, are you aware of this? Did you know about this? And to a T, I got a response back, no, I hadn't heard of this. But when I started reading it, I was like, this is why, from a school standpoint, this is talking about not what the school is providing. This is support for the family after the
Hmm.
child leaves school. This is your wraparound. This is your summer. This is your time when parents have children that, my goodness, that I've been working with both a double whammy. They had severe cognitive disabilities and severe behavior disabilities. And for your audience, when I talk about that, we're talking about kids that I experienced in which the parent would pull up to drop their kid off for school and the child would not get out of the car and ended up kicking the windshield out of the car, to coming in and we're talking about just severe traumatic behaviors of biting, punching, headbutting, hitting. That, yes, the school district is doing everything they can to meet the requirements of the individual education plan. But then it's like, okay, what are we doing for the poor parent or parents that are now having to deal with this? And when I read through the case, I was like, oh, I know exactly what this is talking about. And that is, in the Quad Cities, we saw an establishment of 3 autism centers. Well, the autism centers were for parents and students to go outside of school. That was additional supports that they would have. And those were all insurance-driven services. That's fee for service. And so the first thing they would have is goals for the student. And if the student didn't reach those goals at the end of the week or the end of the month, they got kicked out. That was like, well, you didn't meet your goals. We're not paying for it anymore. And that was so frustrating because the school could not operate independent from these agencies. We had to have them at the table at the IEP meeting, the individual education plan meeting, as a partner, because we wanted to make sure that whatever strategies that you're using in your agencies or your services, we wanted to make sure that we were not doing something to undermine or go in an opposite direction of what you were doing. And then likewise, the agency was asking the school district, well, what strategies and services and how are you delivering those so that we're on the same page? Because the last thing you wanted to have was 2 different approaches and one group is undermining the other and you're not talking to each other and you didn't even know. You didn't even know.
Right. Yeah, that lack of communication can cause a lot of issues, and kind of tying back to that, unintended consequences, right? I firmly believe that everyone involved in this process, they want to help kids, right? They want to help people that are struggling. It's just having a system that smooths the road forward, right? So that we're all, like you said, on the same page. And that I think is where a lot of our issues are coming from within the state systems.
It's critical because when you have a continuum of care from the time a child gets up to the time they go to bed, especially when we're talking about many times children on the autism spectrum, on that continuum. And the thing that is critical is a routine. Once you get that down, you get that routine down and they know what's coming up, what's next, then you can start to see some improvements. And it is painfully slow. Glacial speed is what we're talking about, but moving forward nonetheless. And that's where everybody, parents, teachers, social workers, special ed, psychologists, the whole group have got to be working and oars in and oars pulling in the same direction.
Otherwise, we're just spinning in circles.
That's exactly right. Because if one side's not rowing and the other side is, you're just, you know what direction you're going, and it's just in a circle.
And I think there's something to be said about this process of working together. There's always going to be bumps in the road, right? That's true in every system. If you're a person of a religious background, we come from a broken world and we can't help messing up sometimes. Having said that, with this settlement? Yes, it was just finalized this last year, but it's been kind of in debate and in process for the last 5 or 6. Um, where does the buck stop when it comes to accountability? I know that a lot of my private conversations with people involving this kind of system, there's perception that they just get passed around in circles when trying to navigate the system. Where would you say the buck stops with decisions that are affecting these children's services and access to them?
Well, I believe your question is going to be rooted in the fact that no one in this country has a right to an education. It's not in the Constitution. As a matter of fact, what's not listed in the Constitution becomes a state responsibility, except there is one group of students that has a right to an education because of the passage of the IDEA, Individuals with Disability Education Act. So when it comes to where it starts, and I can't say it stops, but it starts with the school districts. When you're talking about children between basically grade school age, say age 5 to 21, depending upon what their needs are, that's where it starts. And legally, that's where the buck stops, is there. However, that's only 6 hours out of a 24-hour day. So who's responsible for the other 18 hours? Well, now all of a sudden, that's this conversation. That was the lawsuit that went through. And that's where, as a society, as a state of Iowa, as a county, whether you're, and again, I represent Clinton, Jackson, and Scott counties, well, then it falls into whether, if you're in town, it would be your city councils. And if you're in a rural area, or it could be your county supervisors. And so they have, and every county belongs to a mental health district. And now you're going to get me going on that, because we used to have 14 mental health districts, and we over here in Eastern Iowa belong to the Eastern Iowa Mental Health District. And it constituted, what was it, maybe 6 counties or something like that. And while that's a big area, it still was manageable that even if you had 2 representatives or 3 representatives from each county, you would have a mental health commission advisory group of maybe 13 people. And they could address the needs of, this is what my community needs. And there would be similarities, but there's also differences about what they need. Well, now, through this consolidation into 7 mental health districts, and then the consolidation of pulling all the resources back to Des Moines through this Health and Human Services Agency, of which the lawsuit was CA versus Garcia. Garcia is Kelly Garcia, the director of Health and Human Services. That's where it came from. Therein lies an issue, and that the further government gets away from the people they're serving, the less effective they become. And I feel like I'm in a world of Alice in Wonderland, where up is down and down is up and right is left, left is right. In other words, my Republican colleagues used to tout that government closest to the people is most responsive. And I completely agree with that. And yet here we are turning around. And now all of a sudden we've got a mental health district that includes Blackhawk County. So we go from Waterloo over to Dubuque and down to Keokuk. And the board is going to be 13 people. Oh, that is just ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. And so all in the name of efficiency and, waste, fraud, and abuse, all that kind of stuff that's going on right now. And when in fact, what we're doing is we're just going to be leaving kids behind. We're going to be leaving adults behind. And I can tell you there's the county supervisors are just as frustrated, because all of us live in the communities that we serve. We're here. We know people. They're our neighbors. They're our friends. We go to church with them. We work with them. And yet their voice, when you're spread out that far, the needs of Waterloo are going to be different from the needs of Maquoketa or, Fort Madison or something like that. So I'm sorry. It just is. I just see it, and I just feel like it's slipping away from us, and that we're going to be hurting a lot of people before all of a sudden it dawns on us that this was a bad idea.
No, and there's no need to be sorry. I'm glad you brought that up. That's an excellent point. I was having a conversation the other day with Representative Robert Henderson, and we spent a lot of time talking about this idea of community, right? And how community has drastically changed over the last 20 to 30 years. It was not uncommon to live 2-3 houses down from a family member, right? And you knew everyone on your block, and you had to run to the store, go over to so-and-so's house real quick, right? And you would trust to a degree your community to help and assist when you needed it. And in a lot of cases in modern times, knowing your neighbor is sometimes not the case, let alone knowing somebody 3-4 houses down, right? So people used to work. If you were born in a city, you kind of worked in that city, maybe a little bit outside, but pretty close. Now, I have family members that live extremely far away, halfway across the country, right? And we don't see each other as frequently. And so community has changed. And there was, in this conversation, a lot of talk about how do we foster that type of community again, so that we can root a lot of these services that are needed locally. And so I think it's something that at least a few people on each side agree with. But I think a lot of it, again, kind of goes down to the unintended consequences, right? Yes, of course, we want accountability within financial systems, but we don't necessarily want it at the expense of access to services that kids need, right? So I think you bring up an excellent point in how, this system, and I wasn't a part of that discussion, and some of the people I've talked to weren't a part of that rolling out either on both sides. And so now it's like, how do we address the consequences of those actions moving forward? What are your thoughts on that?
I agree. And this conversation is coming home, and that is, as we're having conversations about taxes, it comes back to also about what are the services that our citizens in Iowa expect to have. And those services translate into community. What type of community do you want to have? Well, what constitutes a community? Is it just like-minded individuals? Is it by the fact that you live close to each other? Is it, I live in town because they have a hospital, they have a grocery store, they have a gas station, they have a movie theater. That's how I define community. They have a church, a place that I worship at. Well, and I'm digressing for a moment, but that was the exact conversation I had with this pharmacy benefit management, in that all of a sudden we were losing independent pharmacies. Well, a pharmacy is part of a community. It's about relationships. It's about, I know you, and I know the medications you're on, and I know what to move. And not only that, I could talk to you, versus everything's going to be by mail, and we're going to get rid of people, and we're not going to have that. So yes, our conversation started talking about mental health and services for students, but it's about community, and it's about what's the quality of life and where are we going? And I say that because we also had a big discussion about the governor's preschool 4-year-old program. And that led into this whole thing in Iowa. We have something called continuum of care, and it goes from birth to 5-year-old. And this bill was basically just taking a third of the funds and linking it to all-day 4-year-old preschool. Well, I'm for that. The Iowa Association of School Boards is number one on that. But then when I started talking to groups called ECI, Early Childhood Iowa, there's 34 of them in Iowa. And they are there because they know what their communities need. They know what childcare they need. They know what transportation. They know that we're in an area where we need to be training our new mothers on breastfeeding, on just a car seat. What do you use car seats? All that kind of stuff. Well, all of a sudden, once I started digging into this and I found out what we were losing to get the 4-year-old preschool, I said, I can't support that. I said, now, if you're going to put more funds into this to support the birth, the 1-year-olds, the 2-year-olds, the 3-year-olds, and the 5-year-olds, well, that's a different story. But what they were wanting to do is consolidate the 34 ECIs into, you guessed it, the 7 behavioral districts. I'm like, are you kidding? And I said this on the Senate floor, and I picked Western Iowa. I said, you mean to tell me that we're going to pick a county up by Minnesota and it's going to have the same needs as the one down by Missouri? I said, seriously? So yes, what constitutes community?
And I like how you brought that up. Different communities do have different needs, right? And as an educator, I think you're well aware, we look at our students like that, right? I'm going to interact with one student differently in some ways. I'm going to interact with another because I know what they need. I'm going to press a student to embrace struggle a little bit more than maybe another student at a certain time because I know what they need. And I think a lot of the push lately, even within education, but also within the state, is searching for a standardized solution, right? We want to be able to say, hey, here's the answer, implement this, it's going to fix it. And anybody who's worked in any kind of school setting or a setting where you're working with people in general, that could be hospital, it could be anything, you know that there's no standardized solution, right? There's just individuals, and individuals need to be treated differently. And it's interesting looking at a community in that lens. So thinking about that, and I know this is going to be kind of a question that lends itself easier to a standardized answer. Looking at this rollout of the settlement with the class action versus Garcia case, that doesn't require kind of full implementation, if I remember right, till about 2032. What are some stopgap measures that you feel we should, as a state community, be looking at implementing so that in the time between now and then, families aren't left in too much struggle, more struggle than they can.
I would say one, that since we're talking about young adults, 21 and under, and the reason that you and I are talking about 21 is that a student, if they have an individual education plan, and that plan can allow a student to receive services to age 21. Mm-hmm. And I'm just going to add, by the way, there is another program called Transition Alliance program. It's called TAP. We love our acronyms, but that is a program that is operated in combination with folk rehab, and students and the school district can continue to provide services to students to age 25. And usually that was for job coaching, keeping a job, finding a residence, that kind of stuff. So I've been involved with that also to continue to provide services for our families. And I say that to answer your question, and that as I read through the lawsuit, there was an independent, not mediation, but evaluator that would be agreed upon by both the department, the HHS and the family. And so then I saw that instead of there being like weekly benchmarks or whatever, it was based on 180 days. So with 180 days, there would be an evaluation of how that program is going. So we're holding an accountability that if we're trying something and it's not working, we still have enough time to make those adjustments. And when you're doing a semi-annual versus a monthly or something like that, I thought, okay, yeah, that's way more realistic. And so I thought that was helpful. Mm-hmm. And then also what continues to concern me is that when we're talking about parents getting help for students with severe behavioral, both cognitive and behavioral needs, this is dependent upon where a parent lives. Because if I live in a metropolitan area like the Davenport Quad Cities or Cedar Rapids or Iowa City or Des Moines, that's where these autism centers are going to be located. That's where your expertise is at. But heavens to Betsy, if I'm out in a rural area, I might have to drive an hour to get those services or something like that. Well, now the barriers are transportation, costs. I mean, you just got a whole array of how are we going to do that? So the governor and Health and Human Services on the medical side are talking about this hub and spoke model because we've got 66 counties in this state that have no OBGYNs. No, nothing. Well, I could sit there and say no OBGYNs, no psychologists, no psychiatrists, no mental health services. I mean, we've got areas that are just absolute service deserts. Mm-hmm. And so that becomes our challenge of, how do we, I'm going to paraphrase. I'm going to use Senator Chuck Grassley's words when he was in the Iowa Senate in 1974, and he came up with the creation of the area education agencies. And it was premised upon something that I firmly believe what he said, and that is no student or child in this state should be denied services because of where they live. Okay, well then I say we need to be continuing to follow that challenge and be looking at not tearing our area education agencies down, but building them up and saying, okay, you're located out in these areas. You've got sub offices, satellite offices of which to be able to provide services to parents wherever they're at. But instead, we're going backwards in early childhood, continuum of care. We're going backwards in mental health services. We're going back in health services. I mean, we are going backwards in a direction that is just really, really unsettling.
Yeah, and I think you're spot on there. And kind of ties something that's near and dear to me and conversations I've had with. I was actually talking to Kevin Alon's the other day, and um, we got on the topic of something very similar, but it was how the state, and this is before Representative or Senator Alon's time in office, but how the state privatized a lot of the service providers in the belief that it would save taxpayer money. And they viewed that current system as being very inflated and bloated. And in our conversation, it was brought out that, okay, this transition to privatization had a lot of unintended consequences as well. And so now we're seeing that we have a lot of the same issues as we did under a almost fully public Medicaid provider system. What do you think is the solution there? Because a fully public system seemed to have troubles. A fully private, almost fully private system seems to have troubles. How do we merge these to kind of mitigate a lot of those unintended consequences while still providing stable access to services?
Well, that's a great question. And I wish I could sit here and tell you I've got the answer, because if I did, I probably wouldn't be, you and I wouldn't be talking. I'd be making whatever.
Your consulting fee would be sky high.
Exactly. And I say that because we're looking at that not only at the state level, but at the federal level. It's like, if we just would run everything like a business, well, then it would be all better. Well, then all of a sudden we start going to business and find out that, okay, one, you need to make money, and a business is they exist to make money. And I think we need to come back and redefine, in my mind anyway, my opinion, what are services? What's a service? And what is something that would be better handled by business, in which, I look at when we privatized cleaning restrooms on our rest areas in Iowa. Okay. So they moved that over to business. Okay. That's fine. I got that. But let's take a look at something else. My wife retired from the Postal Service. Well, if we privatize the Postal Service, where do you make money? You don't make money by delivering mail when there's 1 country mile between one house and another house. You can't make money there. You make money when I can sit there and walk from one house to another house to another house to another house. And in that amount of time, I can hit 40 houses in the time it takes me to hit one house.
Right.
So then what happens with the rural areas? Well, you don't make money out there. But that's been our thing, whether it's delivering internet service, whether it's delivering phone service, whether it's delivering mail service, whatever it is. If we were to go that route where, this is about making money, I'm sorry, rural folks, you get squat. You don't get anything because it's just too expensive to serve you. I'm sorry. You chose that way of life, and sayonara. That's it. But that's not how we can operate. There's no way, no how. So whether it's a combination of where a business says, hey, I'll take the towns where we can make money, I can do that. And you know what? We can't on the rural area. We're going to turn that over to the state or whatever it is. That's going to be a rural service, and you take it from there. Maybe that's a combination we're talking about. I don't know. I'd have to see a fiscal note on that.
Right. No, absolutely. And I think that that example, I believe, ties in very well to kind of how the MCL and providers in the state of Iowa, when it comes to Medicaid eligible children, go about selecting who they'll treat. It seems like there's a lot of cherry picking, window shopping, whatever you want to say, for those easier clients, right? That are going to bring that profit in, and where a lot of the more difficult cases are left kind of, oh, we don't have a bed, we can't provide for their needs, and so then we start shopping out of state, which raises prices exorbitantly. Ultimately, if there's nothing there, then the MCOs, they come back and they say, well, hey, there's nothing available. Just hold on. And so, I think that's where a lot of need exists at the moment. And then tying into that, what role do you believe the legislator should play, or outside group, if you will, should play in monitoring the implementation of the state's obligations or HHS's obligations under this settlement, not just legally, but morally?
The monitoring piece, I would say the legislature, that is not their responsibility at all. That's what we have an auditor for. That's why we have the elected positions, whether it's state auditor, whether it's a county auditor, whether it is county board of supervisors. Well, again, the county board of supervisors is going to rely on their auditor, especially on the fiscal side of it. From a program standpoint, I would have to think about that a little bit further. I think that's where our private attorneys step in to say, hey, are they, or our attorney general that's their role is the state holding up what they're supposed to be doing. And then you've got your private attorneys that are making sure, or it is attorneys that are representative of a group of people that will step forward and be advocates on behalf of a group. So that would be the accountability piece. But the legislator, that is not their job at all. Oh my God, we have a hard enough time just trying to make sure we get together and I talk about the same thing. I can't. Yeah.
You get enough emails about property taxes.
Yeah, that's what we create agency for. But I would like to swing back and just to your point about the CA versus Garcia that I picked up on right off the bat. And that is Iowa has very few in-state behavioral proven placements. And so when I was here along the river, I had to go to Illinois to get that kind of help. And to do that, I had to have the Department of Education sign off on and grant approval to do that. And so this is where all of a sudden you might have parents, if they live along a border state, where all of a sudden it's Nebraska or Missouri or Minnesota or Illinois or South Dakota, any of the states that are bordering us, they might have to go to appeal to the Department of Education that, hey, for residential or whatever, it's just not here. Or maybe it's even for day because the school district does not have the capability of handling some of the needs of the students. And so that out-of-state placement was and is a huge issue. And Iowa just has very limited options for those types of needs.
Now, how do you envision tackling that? Is that something you think could be addressed through incentives, tax incentives, startup costs, grants, etc., to entice more private providers, or is there something in the public provider space that you feel would be better way to address that? What are your thoughts on how to move forward in increasing the number of both residential and non-residential providers in the state?
Yeah, on residential, when it comes to that, did not have, I'm trying to think, Rosecrans was in Illinois, I believe. We had Tanager Place, and now I think they closed. I'm trying to think of the agencies that I worked with when I had students and families that needed residential, and it was pretty tough. I'll give you an example. We were using, it was called Camelot, and then it changed to High Roads, and this was a private school agency, and they had a school in Milan, Illinois, and they were receiving students from as far away as 90 miles, an hour and a half away. Schools, rural schools especially, were driving kids to that school to get their services that they need, then picking them up and drive back. So they would be on the road for 3 hours a day trying to get these types of services. We looked at that, and I was fortunate enough that it was only a 30-minute drive or 25-minute drive. And so we had a driver and a bus, all that kind of stuff that gets over there. And then when they get there, sometimes we would have a paraeducator that we would hire to go with them, and they would be there. Or other times we would pay for the school to actually provide a paraeducator plus the teacher. And oftentimes we might have 2-on-1, 2 adults for 1 kid or something like that. Bottom line is the cost of providing this type of education and these services, especially those that needed specialized, maybe counseling and, just behavior modification, we could be talking anywhere from $45,000 to $90,000 per student. And so then you're asking yourself, to your question, where are those funds coming from? And then the other thing is, I can't tell you the number of times I would be over at the school and I would walk out and I'd scratch my head and I go, is this the best where we send all of the worst behaving kids to one location? And then I'm looking at what the adults are going through every day. And I thought, oh my God, I don't know if I could do this every single day like this. And is it the right thing to concentrate all the students with the most severe needs into one location, or do you spread them out? Because then when you talk to a student and they say, well, everybody acts like this, and they're not wrong. They're right, because we put them in a situation where all their peers are all acting the same way. So in their world, everybody acts that way.
Yeah, then behaviors become normalized.
Yes.
No, that's a great thought. I hadn't really looked at it from that. So you going? I know we kind of been all over the place today, which is great. I love conversations that go that route. In our prior communication, you raised some concerns about the state budget that was passed, despite there being a $900 million shortfall. What should Iowans know about how this budget was passed and why it was passed, and what maybe wasn't shared with the public or made widely known?
I would say this, and on WQPT, there's a show that Jim Mertens does locally, and he was interviewing Representative Gary Moore, who is the chair of the Appropriations Committee on the House side. And Gary's comment was, we got $7 billion that we've been able to save over the last 10 years. And that's because they underfunded schools. They underfunded every single program. They kept the taxing rate the same so they could build up that. Then COVID hit, they got even more money that could sit in there. And so they built up this huge pot of money. And then they started implementing the tax cuts with a 3.8% cap on income. They reduced the corporate tax from like 8.5 to 5.5 or something in that range. And then that left basically sales tax. We haven't done anything with sales tax. But I'm looking at this and I'm saying, okay, you've got a $9.4 billion. And I'm looking at every appropriations bill, and they're adding money here, they're adding money there, but then they're totally dismantling the AEA. So they underfund or cut like $33 million out of that. At the same time, Gary, during the interview, didn't say one thing about the $144 million for this educational savings account, aka the voucher program that they're putting into private schools. And what they have not leveled with Iowans is that the income for fiscal year 24 was $8.4 billion. They passed a budget, or no, it was $8.5 billion, and they passed a budget of $9.4 billion and some. So it was $917 million more than what we brought in is what the budget was for. And I'm going to say to you, and I'm going to sit there and scream this on the rooftops, and that is, why don't you level with Iowans and say, these are the services that you're going to get for $8.5 billion. This is it. And we're going to cut. And that's what you got to live with. And once they start being honest about what their vision is of what government services should be for Iowans, then we're going to have a true conversation about whatever it is that they're looking at, or whatever their vision is, what that's going to be, because we just cannot keep doing this. And then on top of it, I will not be surprised one bit if we're called back to a special session, because when we were going through the appropriations bill, I cannot tell you how many of them said state funding will be this, and then it will be paired with federal funding. And I'm sitting here looking at federal funding, and I'm looking at DOGE and what they're cutting. And I'm going, folks, what's your intention if you don't get these federal dollars? How is that going to impact over here? And the answer has been crickets, absolute crickets.
In your conversations, when you brought this up, was there any talk from the other side of the aisle on their justifications why, or their philosophy, or was it, like you said, just crickets?
It's just all part of the plan. If you asked them and said, we've been planning this, it's all part of the plan. We want to keep the money in the taxpayers' pockets, and we're going to use this rainy day fund that we've built up, and that's going to cover the deficit until it doesn't cover it anymore. And we're living in an economic theory. That's what we're living in right now. And everybody's going to see what becomes of that theory. But as of right now, Iowa ranks 49th in GDP growth. I mean, we're scraping the bottom on every single thing regarding economic development and economic growth in this state compared to the rest of the country, and even Washington, D.C. And then on top of it, we're sitting at number 1 or 2, not in education like we used to. We're now number 20. We're sitting in 1 and 2 in cancer rates. That's what we're sitting at. I mean, I don't know. You just can't make this stuff up.
No, you can't. And I think that's been a long time concern of mine as well, is cancer rates, especially here on the western side of the state. I'm sure most people have family members that have been impacted by that, and that's a whole another can of worms to open up and dig into, which I I think when I get to that point, I'm definitely going to have to ask you back on to explore that. But looking at this budget shortfall, what services or programs do you fear are most at risk with this budget?
Well, I think you and I have talked about this. It is cutting the mental health services. And how are we doing that? Well, we're doing that by, one, reducing the number of mental health districts, making them larger, pulling the funds back and concentrating them in Des Moines at the Department of Health and Human Services. And then that leads to, I appreciate Director Garcia. She's under the gun going, you've got to cut your budget. You've got to cut your budget. Well, what does she do? Well, she fights Medicaid expansion. She has to, because that's a big portion of the money. And then that leads to the lawsuit that you and I are just talking about, because she's turning around saying, no, we're not going to pay for coverage at home. We're not going to pay for this. I'm going to fight you at every step of the way about placing a kid outside of state, because what did you and I just talked about? These kids at service can cost anywhere from $45,000 to $90,000 a kid. Mm-hmm. So, you got 100 kids or 200 kids across the state or 500 kids or whatever, it starts adding up really fast. Very quickly. So when all you're doing is looking at the dollar amount and you're not putting the human factor into that, then you end up with this. It's cutting of ECI, Early Childhood Iowa, that continuum of service. How are we going to do that? Well, let's reduce the number of ECI districts. Let's make them into these great big conglomerates, and then we'll concentrate everything back at Des Moines. And we got one person making the decisions on who's going to get what services. That's what's happening. That's what's happening right now.
Yeah, it seems to me that by taking all those funds and centralizing them, you've made one access point. Right? Whereas before, if you would take those same funds, divvy them out to more community-based zones, you would have a whole lot more access points, right? And it would, to my way of thinking, streamline access. Now, I'm not a policy expert, but it just seems from a logical standpoint where you would want more access points. Yes, the director might have to provide oversight and do a lot of checking in with the various heads of those areas to make sure that everything's running smoothly. But I would think that would be a simpler job than overseeing all the funds directly.
I think what you do is you got two approaches. You can facilitate and provide information to your smaller mental health districts, ECI districts, that kind of stuff. And this is the conversation you and I have had, and that is the needs are going to be different, and we're going to run into bumps. And I call that, if you're not encountering failures, you're not trying stuff. And it's not that you don't sit there and if something's failing, that you just keep doing it over and over and over and expecting a different result. But you need to be able to go back to the toolbox and say, okay, I tried this. We did it for this amount of time. I had benchmarks on checking progress throughout the time. And you got to give it, maybe it's 180 days or something like that. And then you look at it and you go, okay, we're really not seeing the progress. But if we're going to do something different, I need to know, I need to have access to the resources to say, what are we going to try that's different? And you don't have to go that long. If you're hurting somebody, for God's sakes, you don't continue to do it for 180 days. You stop right off the bat.
I would hope not. Yeah. Yeah. No, I do. I think you have a very logical perspective on this. And I think sometimes that gets lost in the sea of voices that are speaking out on different things. I've enjoyed this conversations. I know we don't have too much time left, but is there anything else that you would like to add to any of the topics we've talked about?
No, I think I just, again, so appreciate this conversation. It's gone by really quickly. And I'm going to tell you, I am not an expert in any way, shape, or form. What I will say is that what I've shared with you have been my life experiences working with so many parents and students. And if you would have asked me 20 years ago or 25 years ago, I didn't know any of this stuff. But as we've come along and I've made mistakes with parents and students, and we've learned from that, and we said, okay, I've got to not be so rigid. I need to be expanding my mind and looking at and asking the question, constantly asking the question, if not this, what else? And then basically researching and reading and knowing that I could pick up the phone and contact my area education agencies, because while I have one school district, they have 18 or 20 or 50 school districts, and they can say, you know what, Mike, we tried this over here. Why don't you try that? Or you know what, how about we come in and we put some eyes on this and give you some feedback, because you're so close to it that you might be not seeing the forest for the trees, so to speak. And you know what? Every single one of us need that kind of support. Say, yeah, please come in and take a look at it. And if you see something that I'm missing, tell me.
Yeah, and I think that rigidity in thinking, how you were speaking to that and how you kind of moved away from that and become more open to different perspectives is the way I took your statement. I think that's something I can definitely agree with you on. When I was younger, I was very, very strong opinion. Not to say I'm not still having strong opinions. I still do, but I think I've grown in a lot of ways to be able to listen to other perspectives and admit when, maybe my perspective isn't correct or isn't the only way. And I think that what's one of the goals I have for this show is to just foster productive, respectful conversations where there's equal parts listening and equal parts discussing. Because I feel like a lot of times in today's day and age, people talk past each other, and they're more concerned about stating their opinion as rather than listening to somebody else's and truly thinking about. And as an educator, I'm sure you've done the same thing that I do with my students. Is you need to listen more than you speak, and not just listen, but you need to think about what the other person is saying, and then you can formulate a response. And I think we need more of that in society. And so that's one of my goals. I'd love to have you back on the show at some point down the line. If you ever have an issue that you'd like to speak out on, please reach out to me and let me know. We'd be happy to do another episode.
Oh, not a problem. I'd love to. If you ever want to talk about eminent domain and carbon sequestration, just look me up. We'll have that conversation.
Hey, that eminent domain, I'm definitely going to take you up on that. That is one of the issues I would love to speak with. Well, Senator Zimmer, thank you so much for being on today. I've really enjoyed our conversation, and I look forward to many more.
Very good. Thank you so much again for the invitation.
Yep. You have a great day, sir.
You too. Bye now.
Bye.
A huge thank you to Senator Mike Zimmer for joining us. That was really a grounding conversation, and it pulls back the curtain on the machinery behind these issues. Hearing a legislator lay out the challenges so clearly, you start to see how interconnected everything is. A few things from that conversation are really sitting with me. First is his pay now or pay later philosophy. The idea that underfunding mental health services for children doesn't actually save money. It just pushes the cost onto our public safety and justice systems down the road. Second is the stark reality of the state budget. The senator mentioned that recent tax cuts and new private school voucher programs have put a major strain on state revenues, leaving less for essential services. It highlights a fundamental conflict between the state's spending priorities and its legal obligation to fulfill the promises of the CA vs. Garcia settlement. And finally, the devastating human cost of these decisions. When Senator Zimmer pointed out that Iowa leads the nation in the incarceration of children of color, he linked it directly to these same shortcomings in our mental health system. It's a powerful reminder that these aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. These are children's lives. So the question we're left with is this: what does it say about state priorities when a court-ordered solution to a children's mental health crisis is met with such a clear lack of urgency? It's a heavy question, and it brings us back to the core of this podcast, which is where we as citizens, where do we fit into this picture? The system, as we've heard across these episodes, from Nina's impossible choice to our schools bearing an unfair burden, to Senator Zimmer's candid assessment of the budget, is designed to make you feel isolated and overwhelmed. It thrives on your silence, on your exhaustion, because it knows that people who are tired and alone eventually give up. But here on Let's Talk Iowa, we choose something different. Building on what we've uncovered so far, I'm asking for your help to turn this ongoing conversation into a powerful force for change. First, stay informed. The issues we're discussing are complex, and I don't want to give you an incorrect impression that there's an easy answer to all this. There's not. They're very complex problems, but those answers don't come unless we try, and they don't come unless we're talking about the issues. We can't shove this settlement, like Ms. Garcia seemingly wants to do, into a corner, try to hide it, ignore it, and hope it goes away, because it's not. Keep visiting our website, letstalkiowa.com, where you'll find links to the settlement itself, the documents, and some other resources. Understanding your rights is the first step towards demanding them. Second, demand urgency. Senator Zimmer highlighted the lack of urgency in Des Moines to implement this federal court order. That urgency has to come from us. Find your state senator and representative and ask them direct questions. What are you doing to ensure the state budget adequately funds the mental health services required by the CA vs. Garcia settlement? Your call makes this issue impossible to ignore. And third, share your truth. Your story is the evidence that this is not an abstract policy debate. If you are fighting this battle, I want to hear from you. Send your story to chad@letstalkiowa.com. Your voice adds to a chorus that is growing louder with every episode. I know this fight feels impossible sometimes. I'm in it. But I also know that we are fueled by something far more than bureaucracy, and it's a ferocious love for our children. And that is the source of our strength. Thank you for being a part of this crucial conversation, and stay tuned because we have more to uncover. I want to ask you to do one thing today. Share this episode. Share it with a friend, with a legislator, with someone who still believes this isn't happening in Iowa. And if you're a parent, a provider, or someone living through this system, reach out. You are not alone. You can email me at chad@letstalkiowa.com or find more information at our website, letstalkiowa.com. Because this isn't just a podcast. It's the beginning of a conversation we've needed for too long. Stop staying silent. Let's talk Iowa. Let's keep going. Every share helps raise awareness, and every conversation starts with a story. Follow us on Facebook at Let's Talk Iowa and on Instagram at Let's Talk Iowa Podcast for episode updates, behind-the-scenes content, and ways to take action. Because truth changes policy, and Iowa families deserve better. Truth matters. Families matter. You matter. Let's Talk Iowa. We'll see you next time. It's the beginning of a conversation we've needed for too long. Stop staying silent. Let's talk Iowa. Let's keep going.